I need to tell you something I've kept buried for 30 years, and I need to tell it now before the weight of it follows me into the ground. My name is John Mercer. I'm 55 years old, and I live alone in a cabin 15 miles outside of Ashland, Maine. People in town know me as the quiet guy who used to work for the Forest Service, the one who took early retirement after some kind of breakdown nobody talks about. They're not wrong about the breakdown, but they don't know why it happened. They don't know what I found in the winter of 1995, deep in the North Woods where the snow gets so thick it swallows sound itself. They don't know about the mine shaft. They don't know about the cage. And they sure as hell don't know about the thing I kept there for almost 7 years. I was 25 when I became a forest ranger. Young, strong, full of that stupid confidence you have when you think you understand how the world works. I'd grown up in these woods, spent every summer fishing the streams with my father before he passed, knew the trails like the lines on my own palms. The job was perfect for me. Long days of solitude, checking equipment, marking hazards, making sure hikers didn't get themselves killed doing something careless. I liked being alone out there. Preferred it, actually. My ex-wife used to say I loved those trees more than I loved her, and maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. There's a peace in the forest that you can't find anywhere else, a kind of silence that feels older than human beings. That winter was brutal. We'd had 3 feet of snow by Thanksgiving, and by January, some of the old logging roads were completely impassable. I was doing a week-long patrol through the northwestern quadrant, checking the old survey markers and looking for fallen trees that might block the spring melt. The temperature was hovering around 10 degrees, and the sky had that flat gray quality that means more snow is coming. I remember my breath freezing on my beard, remember the sound of my snowshoes crunching through the crust, remember thinking that I might be the only human being within 20 miles. That's when I found the tracks. I'd seen a lot of animal prints in my time. Moose, deer, bear, even the occasional wolf, but these were different. They were huge, for one thing, maybe 18 inches long and shaped almost like human footprints but wrong in ways that made my stomach tighten. The stride was impossibly long, and whatever made them was heavy enough to punch through the snow crust that would have supported a full-grown man. But it was the drag marks between the prints that really bothered me. Like something was being pulled. Or like whatever was walking was so weak it could barely lift its feet. I followed those tracks for 2 hours, my heart hammering harder with each step. They led me up into the hills, into a section of old-growth forest that loggers never touched because the terrain was too steep and rocky to be worth the trouble. And then, just as the light was starting to fail, I found the mine. It was one of the old silver prospects from the 1880s, the kind of operation that lasted maybe 6 months before the investors realized there was nothing down there worth digging for. The entrance was just a black hole in the hillside, maybe 6 feet high, with rotting timber supports and a pile of rusted equipment half buried in the snow. I'd known about it, of course. It was marked on the Forest Service maps as a hazard site, but I'd never actually visited it. Never had a reason to. The tracks led right inside. I should have turned around. Should have radioed for backup, or at least waited until morning. But there was something about those tracks, something about the way they staggered and dragged, that made me think whatever left them was hurt. Possibly dangerous, yes, but also suffering. And I've never been good at walking away from suffering, even when I should. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The air in the mine was different, still and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. My light beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rough stone walls and patches of ice where water had seeped through and frozen. The tunnel sloped downward, deeper into the hill, and the tracks continued ahead of me, clearly visible in the fine dust that covered everything. I must have walked 50 yards when I heard it. A sound like breathing but wrong. Wet and rattling, with a horrible whistling quality on the exhale. It was coming from deeper in the tunnel, from somewhere beyond the range of my flashlight. I stopped walking. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. Couldn't even speak. And then it spoke to me. "Stay back," it said, and the voice was like nothing I'd ever heard. High and thin and desperate, barely human but not quite animal either. "Stay back or I'll kill you." I should have run. God knows I should have run. But instead I heard myself say, "You're hurt." Silence. Just that terrible breathing. I can help, I said, and even as the words left my mouth I knew how insane they sounded. No one can help, it whispered. I'm so hungry. Please go away. Please. I don't know what possessed me in that moment. Don't know what combination of curiosity and compassion and pure stupid recklessness made me take another step forward. But I did. And my flashlight beam finally found it, huddled in a natural hollow in the rock about 20 feet ahead. I'm not going to tell you it looked like what you've seen in movies or read about in books. I'm not going to describe its face or its body or the way its eyes reflected my light like an animal's, but with something else behind them, something that understood exactly what it was and what it had become. What I will tell you is that when I looked at it, I saw something that was starving to death, something that was in so much pain it could barely move, and something that was absolutely, completely terrified of me. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour but was probably only seconds. When did you last eat? I finally asked. Long time, it whispered. So long. But I can't. If I eat, if I start. It didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 7 years of my life. I stepped backwards slowly, keeping my light on it the whole time. I'm going to leave now, I said. But I'm coming back tomorrow. With food. Do you understand? Why? The word was barely audible. Because you asked me to leave, I said. Because you're trying not to hurt me. That means something. I backed out of that mine shaft, got in my truck, and drove the 2 hours back to my cabin in a kind of daze. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to process what I'd seen, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I couldn't tell anyone. They'd send hunters. They'd send scientists. They'd kill it or trap it or turn it into some kind of circus attraction. The next morning, I loaded up my truck with supplies and drove back into the woods. That was 30 years ago. And that was the day everything changed. I brought deer meat that first time. Had a doe in my freezer from the previous hunting season, and I thawed out about 10 pounds of it overnight. Packed it in a cooler with some ice packs, along with water bottles, a tarp, and my rifle. I wasn't stupid. I knew what I was dealing with could kill me without much effort if it chose to. But I also knew it had chosen not to. That had to count for something. The drive back to the mine took forever. Every mile I kept thinking about turning around, about how insane this was, about all the ways it could go wrong. But I kept driving. Maybe it was the look in those eyes, that desperate fear mixed with something like hope. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't as afraid as I felt. The tracks from the day before were already half filled with fresh snow. I parked at the same spot, grabbed the cooler, and walked up to the mine entrance. This time I called out before going inside. It's me, John. I brought food. Silence. Then that wet, rattling breathing again. I'm going to leave it just inside the entrance, I said. You don't have to come out. I'll go back to my truck and wait. I set the cooler down about 10 feet into the tunnel, right where the sunlight could still reach, and then I retreated. Sat in my truck with the engine running to keep warm, watching the mine entrance through the windshield. 20 minutes passed. 30. I was starting to think it had died during the night when I saw movement. It came forward slowly, staying low to the ground, dragging itself more than walking. In the daylight filtering into the tunnel mouth, I could see it better. See the way its ribs stood out, the patches where something that might have been fur or skin hung loose, the trembling in its limbs. It looked like something that had been starving for months, maybe years. It reached the cooler and stopped, lifted its head toward my truck, and I knew it could see me watching. We stayed like that for a long moment, and then it opened the cooler. I've never seen anything eat like that. The desperation in it, the need. It consumed all 10 pounds in less than 5 minutes, and when it was finished, it just collapsed right there by the cooler, making sounds that might have been crying or might have been something else entirely. I got out of the truck, walked back to the mine entrance slowly, carefully. Are you okay? I asked. It lifted its head. Why are you doing this? I don't know, I said, and it was the truth. Maybe because you asked me to leave yesterday instead of attacking. Maybe because I've spent my whole life in these woods and I've never met anything that could talk. Maybe because everyone deserves a chance not to be what they're afraid of becoming. I'm already what I'm afraid of, it whispered. That's what this is. That's what I am. What happened to you? Long silence. The sound of wind in the trees. I got lost, it finally said. During a winter storm, 7 years ago. I was hiking with friends. We got separated. I walked for days. Ran out of food. Ate bark, roots, anything I could find. And then there was nothing left to eat but... It trailed off. The hunger changes you. Makes you into something else. Something that can't ever be full again, no matter how much you eat. Something that wants things it shouldn't want. I sat down in the snow, right there at the entrance. How long have you been in this mine? 2 years. Maybe longer. Hard to keep track. I stay here because it's easier to resist when I'm alone. When I'm away from people. But you're starving yourself. Better than the alternative. We sat there for a long time, not talking. Finally I said, I'll come back tomorrow. Bring more food. Why would you do that? Because you're trying, I said. That has to mean something. That's how it started. Every 3 days I'd make the drive, bring meat, deer, moose, whatever I could hunt or buy without raising suspicion. Sometimes I'd sit at the entrance and we'd talk. It told me about its life before, about being a graduate student from Boston studying forest ecology, about how the person it used to be felt like someone else entirely now. It told me about the hunger, how it never went away but became manageable if it ate regularly, how it had learned to control itself, to stay away from populated areas, to choose this kind of imprisonment over the alternative. I told it about my divorce, about my father, about why I preferred trees to people, about the loneliness that had always lived inside me, even before I understood what it was. After 6 months, I suggested building a proper enclosure. The mine wasn't safe. Parts of it were collapsing, and winter was coming again. I found an old hunting cabin about 3 miles away, abandoned for at least a decade, hidden in a box canyon that didn't appear on any maps. Spent 2 months reinforcing it, building a secure room with heavy timber walls and a steel door I salvaged from a demolition site. Made it comfortable. Mattress, books, a wood stove for heat. Made it strong enough to hold something that wasn't entirely human anymore. It agreed to move there. I think by then we'd both realized this was going to be a long-term arrangement, this strange partnership between us. I'd bring supplies every week. Food, books, batteries for the radio I'd installed. Sometimes I'd stay for hours, just talking. Other times I'd drop everything off and leave without a word, sensing it needed solitude. The hardest part was keeping it secret. I told the Forest Service I was dealing with family issues, cut my patrols back to the bare minimum, bought meat in different towns, paid cash, varied my schedule so nobody would notice patterns. Started growing more isolated, more paranoid about discovery. But it worked. 4 years it worked. And somewhere in that time something shifted. It stopped being a creature I was helping and became something closer to a friend. Maybe the only real friend I'd had in decades. It told me terrible things during those years. Truths about humanity that I didn't want to hear but couldn't ignore. About how thin the line is between civilization and savagery. About how we're all just hunger wearing different masks. About loneliness and what it does to us, and how sometimes the worst thing isn't becoming a monster. It's realizing you always were one, just a well-fed one. And I listened. Because someone had to. Because in that cabin in the woods, with a creature that shouldn't exist, I finally found something that felt like truth. Year 5 was when everything started getting complicated. I'd settled into a routine by then, supply runs every Wednesday and Sunday, staying for an hour or two each time, bringing news from the outside world via newspapers and magazines. The creature had a particular fascination with current events, as if by understanding what was happening in the world it had left behind, it could somehow remain tethered to its former humanity. I'd bring books too. It had worked through most of the classics by then and had developed a taste for philosophy. Camus in particular. Something about the absurdity resonated. But that May, two things happened almost simultaneously that threatened everything I'd built. The first was that the Forest Service decided to do a complete resurvey of the northwestern quadrant. New GPS mapping, updated trail markers, the works. They were sending a team of 4 rangers, and the projected survey area included a section that came within a mile of the cabin. I got the memo on a Monday morning and felt my stomach drop through the floor. The second was that the creature started getting sick. I noticed it that Sunday visit. It was moving slower than usual. Its breathing more labored. When I asked about it, it initially dismissed my concerns, but I could see the trembling in its limbs, the way it winced when it shifted position. "How long have you felt like this?" I asked. "Few weeks," it admitted. "Getting worse." "What are your symptoms?" "Pain. In the joints mostly. Fever, I think, though it's hard to tell. And the hunger is getting harder to control again." It looked at me with those eyes that had become so familiar over the years. "I think something's wrong with the meat you've been bringing." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "It tastes different lately. Bitter. And my body isn't processing it the same way." I thought about the deer I'd shot 3 weeks ago, remembered how thin it looked, how its behavior had seemed off before I took it down. Chronic wasting disease had been spreading through the deer population that year. I'd thought I was being careful, checking for obvious signs, but maybe I'd missed something. "I might have given you contaminated meat," I said. "Diseased deer." "Can I die from disease?" it asked, and there was something almost hopeful in its voice. "That would be easier than the alternative." "Don't talk like that." "Why not? You've extended this for 5 years, John, but we both know how it ends. Eventually, I'll get hungry enough that I can't control it anymore. Eventually, I'll hurt someone. Better to die now while I still have a choice." I stood up, started pacing. "We'll figure this out. I'll bring different food. Fish, maybe. Or I'll drive down to Boston, buy beef from a grocery store." "The survey team," it interrupted. "You said they're coming next month. Even if I recover, even if we make it through this, they're going to find this place eventually. You can't hide a cabin forever." It was right, and we both knew it. I'd been living on borrowed time, thinking I could keep this going indefinitely. But the world was getting smaller, the forests more mapped and monitored. The isolation that had made this possible was disappearing. I spent the next 2 weeks in a state of controlled panic. Brought high-quality beef from a butcher shop 2 counties over, drove the creature to what passed for a veterinarian in my amateur understanding. Kept it hydrated, monitored its temperature, watched helplessly as it grew weaker. At the same time, I was tracking the survey team's progress, calculating how long I had before they reached our section of the woods. 3 weeks. Maybe 4. The creature's condition stabilized but didn't improve. It could barely stand, spending most of its time on the mattress, drifting in and out of fevered sleep. During its lucid moments, we'd talk about what to do. "You could move me," it suggested one evening. "Farther north into Canada maybe. Less populated up there. In your condition. You wouldn't survive the journey. Then leave me here. When they find this place, tell them you were studying something I don't know. You're a ranger. Make something up. They'd find evidence. They'd ask questions I can't answer." Silence fell between us. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The sounds of a forest that suddenly felt too small for what we needed from it. "There's another option," the creature finally said. I knew what it was going to say before it spoke. "No. You'd be doing me a favor. I've been ready for this for a long time." I said no. "John." It reached out. It had gotten comfortable enough with me over the years to occasionally risk physical contact, and touched my hand with what had once been fingers. "This was always going to be temporary. You've given me 5 years I never thought I'd have. 5 years where I wasn't a monster, where I got to be something close to human again. That's more than I deserved. More than I had any right to ask for." I pulled my hand away. "There has to be another way. Then find it. Because in 3 weeks, those rangers are going to walk right past this canyon, and one of them is going to be curious about that gap in the trees. And then everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed to keep me alive, it's all going to be for nothing. I left that night without another word, drove home in the dark and sat in my kitchen until dawn, staring at nothing. The answer, when it came, was both obvious and terrible. I could move it, but not far. There was a cave system about 8 miles north, deeper into the wilderness, accessed through a ravine that the survey team wouldn't have any reason to enter. It was large enough and isolated enough, but getting the creature there in its weakened state would be almost impossible. I'd need equipment, a stretcher, help, and I couldn't ask for help without revealing everything. Unless. The idea formed slowly, piece by piece. My brother, Marcus, lived in Portland. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since our mother's funeral, but before our falling out, he'd been a wilderness EMT. He knew how to move injured people through difficult terrain. And more importantly, he was the kind of person who'd help first and ask questions later. It was an insane risk, but it was the only option I had. I called him the next morning. The conversation was brief, awkward. I need help moving something, I said. Something heavy. Through rough terrain. What kind of something? Can't explain over the phone. But I need someone I can trust. Someone who won't ask too many questions. Long pause. Then, when? This weekend. He showed up Friday evening, and I knew the moment I saw his face that I'd made a terrible mistake. Marcus had always been able to read me, even when I was lying. We loaded up my truck with the stretcher and equipment in silence, and then, halfway to the cabin, he finally asked, "What the hell have you gotten yourself into, John?" I stared at the road ahead, hands tight on the steering wheel. Something I can't explain. Something you're not going to believe. Try me. So I told him. All of it. The mine, the creature, the 5 years of secrecy. The whole impossible truth. He didn't say a word until I'd finished. Then he said, very quietly, "You've been harboring a fucking Wendigo for 5 years. I've been keeping something alive that was trying not to be a monster." Same thing, John. No, I said. It's not. We drove the rest of the way in silence. Marcus's reaction when he first saw the creature was about what I expected. Frozen shock, followed by a step backward, followed by his hand moving instinctively toward the gun I knew he carried in his jacket. But to his credit, he didn't run. Didn't shoot. Just stood there in the doorway of the cabin, staring. The creature looked up from the mattress, meeting his eyes. "You must be the brother," it said, its voice barely a whisper now. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed. "Close enough," the creature replied, and I saw something that might have been humor flicker across its face. Even at death's door, it kept that particular quality. That ability to find dark comedy in horror. I moved between them. "Marcus, this is..." I paused, realizing I'd never asked its name. Never thought to. In 5 years, we'd discussed philosophy and loneliness and the nature of humanity, but never something as simple as what to call each other. "David," the creature said. "At least, that's who I used to be." Marcus slowly lowered his hand from his jacket. "You're really doing this, John? Moving this thing deeper into the woods?" "I'm moving David to a safer location." "Yes." "And what happens when it gets hungry? When it decides raw deer isn't enough anymore?" "That's not going to happen," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Marcus looked at the creature. At David. "No offense, but from what John tells me, your whole existence is basically one long fight against doing exactly that. What makes you think you'll keep winning?" David met his gaze steadily. "I don't. But I'm still going to try. That's all any of us can do, isn't it? Keep trying not to be the worst version of ourselves, even when everything inside us is screaming to give in." Something changed in Marcus's expression then. Recognition, maybe. Or understanding. He'd had his own demons, pills after a back injury on the job that he'd fought for 2 years before getting clean. I'd never talked about it with him, respected his privacy too much, but I knew. And I think in that moment, he saw something in David that resonated. "All right," he said finally. "Let's get you moved." Getting David onto the stretcher was harder than I'd anticipated. He'd lost so much weight, but moving still caused him obvious pain. Marcus worked with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs I didn't even know to look for, securing straps, preparing for the transport. The EMT training kicked in, overriding whatever horror or disbelief he might have been feeling. We set out just after midnight, using headlamps to navigate the terrain. 8 miles doesn't sound like much, but through unmarked forest in the dark, carrying a stretcher between us, it became an odyssey. We had to stop every 20 minutes to rest, to check on David, to adjust our grip. Marcus never complained, just kept moving forward with grim determination. Around 3 in the morning, we stopped in a clearing to rest. David was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Marcus checked his pulse, then looked up at me. He's not going to make it, you know. Whatever this disease is, it's too far gone. We have to try. Why? Marcus sat back on his heels. I'm serious, John. Why does this matter so much to you? I thought about how to answer that. About all the reasons I'd given myself over the years. Compassion, scientific curiosity, the belief that even a monster deserves a chance at redemption. But sitting there in the darkness, with my brother looking at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years, I knew I owed him the truth. Because I'm lonely, I said. Because I've been lonely my whole goddamn life, and for 5 years I had someone who understood what that felt like. Someone who knew what it was like to be so fundamentally different from everyone around you that connection feels impossible. David gets that. Gets me. And I can't just let that go without a fight. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know that's not healthy, right? Building your whole world around a creature that shouldn't exist." "Probably not," I admitted. "But it's what I have." We reached the cave system as dawn was breaking. The entrance was exactly as I remembered. A narrow split in the rock face, hidden by overgrown ferns and barely visible unless you knew where to look. Inside, it opened into a larger chamber, maybe 30 feet across, with natural skylights that let in enough light to see by. It was cold, damp, but defensible. Safe. We got David settled in a corner we'd prepared with blankets and supplies. He regained consciousness briefly, looked around at the stone walls and nodded. "Better," he whispered. "More permanent." "Nothing's permanent," I said. "But it'll do for now." Marcus stood by the entrance, looking uncomfortable. "What's the plan here, John? You going to keep coming out here? Keep feeding it indefinitely?" "Him," I corrected. "And yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And when the Forest Service comes asking questions about why you've been acting strange, why you've been disappearing into the woods for hours at a time, I'll figure it out." Marcus shook his head. "You're going to lose everything over this. Your job, your reputation, possibly your freedom if anyone finds out what you've been doing." "Maybe," I said. "But at least I'll still have my integrity." "Integrity?" Marcus's voice rose. "You're hiding a creature that's killed and eaten people. How is that integrity?" "I killed people," David said softly from his corner. "Past tense. 7 years ago when I was lost and starving and out of my mind. Since then, John's kept me from becoming that again. Kept me human in the ways that matter. That's worth something." Marcus and I stared at each other. Finally he sighed. "I can't be part of this, John. I've got kids, a life. I can't risk getting tangled up in whatever this is." "I know," I said. "And I'm not asking you to. You got him here. That's more than I had any right to expect. We left the cave together, but I knew something had broken between us. Marcus drove away that morning without another word, and I haven't seen him since. He kept my secret, I'll give him that, but our relationship ended in that cave, killed by truth and impossible choices. The survey team came through 2 weeks later. They found the cabin, asked me about it, and I told them it was a personal project I'd abandoned. They noted it on their maps and moved on. The cave system wasn't in their survey area. David was safe. But he wasn't recovering. Despite my best efforts, despite bringing medicine I couldn't really afford and cooking meat that should have helped, he continued to deteriorate. By June, he could barely speak. By July, he'd stopped eating entirely. I knew what was happening. He'd made his choice. Was starving himself deliberately, ending it on his own terms while he still could. I should have tried to stop him. Should have forced food, kept him alive whether he wanted it or not. But I didn't. Because after 5 years, I'd learned to respect his autonomy, even in this. Especially in this. I was there at the end. Held his hand, or what passed for it, and listened to his final words. "Thank you," he whispered, "for letting me be human one more time." "You were always human," I said. "That was never in question." He smiled, I think it was a smile, and then he was gone. I buried him deep in that cave, sealed the entrance with rocks and walked away. Never went back. Never told anyone the exact location. Some secrets deserve to stay buried. That was 25 years ago. I'm 55 now, retired from the Forest Service for almost 2 decades, living alone in the same cabin where this all started. People in town still think I'm strange, the hermit ranger who lost his mind in the woods, and they're not entirely wrong. I did lose something out there. Or maybe I found something I wasn't supposed to find, and it changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I think about David every day, about the conversations we had in that cabin, about the terrible truths he told me during those long winter nights, about hunger and how we're all fighting some version of it, for food, for connection, for meaning in a world that often feels meaningless, about how the line between human and monster isn't as clear as we'd like to believe, and how sometimes the most human thing we can do is admit how close we are to crossing it. The Forest Service eventually figured out something was off about my behavior back then. There were too many inconsistencies in my reports. Too many unexplained absences. They offered me early retirement with full benefits, and I took it. Seemed easier than trying to explain. My ex-wife called once, years later, asking if I was okay. I told her I was. I'm not sure if that was true then. I'm not sure if it's true now. Marcus never spoke to me again. I heard through family channels that he moved to Colorado, started a new life. I don't blame him for cutting ties. What I asked him to witness, to participate in, wasn't fair. He had a right to protect himself from the weight of that knowledge. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I did the right thing. If keeping David alive for those 5 years was compassionate or cruel. If I was helping him maintain his humanity or just postponing the inevitable in service of my own loneliness. The honest answer is I don't know. Maybe it was both. Maybe that's what compassion always is, a mixture of genuine care and selfish need, impossible to separate. I've started writing this down finally, because I'm not getting any younger. Because secrets have a weight, and I've carried this one long enough that it's starting to crush me. Because maybe someone needs to know that monsters aren't always what we think they are, and humanity isn't always where we expect to find it. The woods behind my cabin are quiet tonight. Snow's coming in. I can smell it in the air, that particular sharpness that means a storm's building. It reminds me of that first winter, of finding those tracks, of making the decision that would define the rest of my life. If I could go back, knowing everything that would happen, would I make the same choice? Yes. Without hesitation. Yes. Because those 5 years, as strange and terrifying and impossible as they were, taught me something essential about what it means to be human. It's not about being good or normal or acceptable to society. It's about trying. About recognizing suffering and responding to it, even when that response defies logic. About sitting with someone in their darkness and saying, I see you. You're not alone. David taught me that. A creature that shouldn't exist, that lived in constant fear of its own nature, taught me more about humanity than any human ever did. I've thought about telling this story before. About going public, letting the world know what I found in those woods. But I never will. It would turn David into a spectacle, reduce him to a monster in people's minds, erase the complex, suffering person he actually was. And I owe him better than that. Owe him the dignity of being remembered as he asked to be remembered, as someone who fought against what he'd become, who chose isolation and eventual starvation over giving in to his worst impulses. That's courage. Real, genuine courage. The kind most people never have to demonstrate because they're never tested that way. But David was tested every single day, and he passed that test until the very end. Sometimes I go hiking in the North Woods, avoiding the area where the cave is but staying close enough to feel connected to that time. I'll stand in a clearing and remember his voice, the particular quality it had, that mixture of despair and determination. I'll remember the conversations about Camus and loneliness and hunger. I'll remember the way he'd tilt his head when he was thinking, the careful distance he'd maintain even after years of trust, the absolute certainty that he was always one bad day away from becoming the thing he feared most. And I'll remember the question he asked me once, late in the 3rd year, when we'd grown comfortable enough with each other to discuss the really difficult things. "Do you think I'm still a person?" he'd asked. "Or am I just a monster pretending?" I'd thought about it for a long time before answering. I think the fact that you're asking the question answers it. Monsters don't care what they are. People do. He'd nodded slowly. Then I'm a person carrying a monster inside me. And every day I have to choose which one wins. Isn't that true for everyone? I'd replied. He'd looked at me then with those eyes that had seen things I couldn't imagine, suffered things I'd never understand, and said, "Yes, I suppose it is. The difference is, most people never have to look their monster in the face. I don't have that luxury. None of us do, really. We just pretend we do. We go through our lives acting like the darkness inside us isn't there, like we're fundamentally different from people who've done terrible things. But we're not. We're all one set of circumstances away from discovering what we're capable of when we're desperate enough, hungry enough, lonely enough." David knew that truth, lived with it every second of every day, and instead of using it as an excuse, he used it as a reason to be better, to try harder, to choose humanity over hunger, even when that choice was agonizing. That's what I learned in those woods. That's what I carried away from 5 years of secret visits and impossible conversations. Not that monsters exist, I'd always suspected that, but that humanity exists in unexpected places. That compassion matters even when it's inconvenient. That sometimes the most important thing we can do is bear witness to suffering without trying to fix it or explain it away. The snow's starting now. Big, soft flakes that catch in the trees and muffle sound. It's the kind of snow that makes the world feel smaller, more intimate. The kind of snow that was falling the night I found those tracks 30 years ago. I'm going to pour myself a drink, sit by the fire, and remember. Remember a person named David who became something terrible and spent the rest of his short life proving that terrible things can still choose good. Remember the weight of secrets and the cost of compassion. Remember that loneliness is a kind of hunger too, and sometimes the only cure is finding someone who understands what that feels like. People say I'm strange. People say I lost my mind in the woods. Maybe they're right. But I don't think I lost anything. I think I found something. A truth about humanity that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. And I think that truth, as uncomfortable and impossible as it is, was worth everything it cost me. The fire's burning low now. The snow's getting heavier. And somewhere deep in the North Woods, in a cave I'll never visit again, a secret stays buried. A person who became a monster who became a person again if only for a little while. A story that shouldn't be possible but is. That's what I needed to tell you. That's what I've been carrying for 30 years. Not the horror of what David was, but the beauty of what he tried to be. Not the monster, but the humanity that persisted in spite of everything. Make of it what you will. I know what it means to me. And that's enough. The woods are quiet tonight. The snow falls soft and steady. And I sit here, an old man with an impossible story, finally unburdened of the weight I've carried for so long. I don't expect you to believe me. I wouldn't believe me either. But it's true, every word. And somewhere in those woods, if you know where to look, you'll find a cave sealed with rocks. You'll find evidence of something that shouldn't exist. You'll find the last resting place of a person who fought harder against their own nature than anyone I've ever met. And maybe, if you're quiet enough, if you're open enough, you'll understand why I'm telling you this. Not for absolution. I'm past needing that. But for memory. so that someone other than me knows that David existed, that he mattered, that his struggle meant something. That's all any of us really want, isn't it? To know that our lives mattered, that we were seen, that we weren't alone. David, wherever you are now, you weren't alone. Not at the end. Not ever. And neither am I.